Imagine the mind of a man who preyed on innocent lives, luring them into a nightmare they could never escape. A man who not only murdered but performed unspeakable acts, leaving a trail of horror that would shake the world to its core. Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Monster, didn't just take lives. He kept trophies, indulged in cannibalism, and even tried to create living zombies. What led this seemingly quiet man to become one of the most notorious serial killers in history? In this video, we dive deep into the chilling story of Dahmer's crimes, his twisted motives, and the terrifying way he evaded capture for so long. Prepare yourself for a journey into darkness. This is not just a story. It's a real-life nightmare that will leave you questioning the limits of human evil. Early life. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. His father worked as a chemist, and his mother struggled with mental health issues, including anxiety and depression. From an early age, Dahmer's home life was unstable due to his parents' troubled relationship. Frequent arguments created a tense atmosphere, and Dahmer often felt neglected, particularly as his mother demanded much of his father's attention. The lack of emotional connection at home led him to become increasingly isolated. As a child, Dahmer was described as quiet, shy, and withdrawn. He rarely interacted with others and struggled to make friends. Although he showed no early signs of violent behavior toward people, he had a peculiar fascination with death. At around the age of 4, after undergoing surgery for a double hernia, his behavior changed, becoming more detached and emotionally distant. This shift was subtle but noticeable to his family. Around the same time, Dahmer began developing a disturbing interest in dead animals. He collected roadkill, dissected small creatures, and stored animal remains in jars. His father, a scientist, initially supported what he thought was a scientific curiosity, unaware of the dark direction it would later take. During his adolescence, Dahmer's isolation deepened. By high school, his few interactions with peers were often awkward or marked by pranks that masked his underlying loneliness. His drinking habits began around this time, and he often arrived at school intoxicated. As his parents' marriage deteriorated, their constant fights added to Dahmer's emotional instability. In 1978, when Dahmer was 18, his parents divorced. His father moved out and his mother left town with his younger brother, leaving Dahmer alone in the family house. This period of isolation only worsened his mental state, as he struggled with both his family's breakup and his own confusion over his sexuality. Dahmer realized he was gay during his teenage years, but kept this hidden, which further distanced him from others. The start of Jeffrey Dahmer's crime. Jeffrey Dahmer's descent into a life of horrific crime began in 1978, when he committed his first murder. At the time, Dahmer was 18 years old and had recently graduated from high school. His parents' divorce had left him feeling abandoned and deeply isolated. Living alone in his family's house in Bath, Ohio, he had complete freedom to act on his darkest impulses. One day in June 1978, Dahmer encountered 18-year-old Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker on the side of the road. Hicks was looking for a ride to a rock concert, and Dahmer offered to take him there. Instead, he invited Hicks back to his home to drink beers. Dahmer was socially awkward and shy, and it seemed that having someone to spend time with even briefly was appealing to him. But his true motive was far more sinister. Once back at the house, the two spent time drinking and chatting, but when Hicks eventually wanted to leave, Dahmer panicked. Unwilling to let him go, Dahmer struck Hicks in the back of the head with a dumbbell, killing him. This was not a spur-of-the-moment act. Dahmer later admitted that he had long fantasized about controlling and possessing another person entirely, and this was the first time he acted on those urges. After the murder, Dahmer dismembered Hicks's body in the basement of his home. He methodically cut the body into pieces, using garbage bags to dispose of the flesh and pulverizing the bones with a sledgehammer. He scattered the remains in the woods near his house. This dismemberment marked the start of a gruesome pattern that Dahmer would follow in many of his later murders, killing, dismembering, and trying to erase any evidence of his crime. Although he killed Hicks, Dahmer was terrified of being caught. The murder left him shaken, but instead of stopping, he managed to bury his feelings and return to his life as though nothing had happened. Remarkably, Despite the brutality of this first crime, Dahmer refrained from killing again for almost 9 years. After nearly 9 years of suppressing his murderous urges, Jeffrey Dahmer's violent streak re-emerged in 1987, and this marked the beginning of his killing spree that would continue until his arrest in 1991. His second murder took place in a Milwaukee hotel room in September 1987, when he killed 24-year-old Stephen Tuomi. Unlike the calculated murder of his first victim, Stephen Hicks, Dahmer later claimed that the killing of Tuomi was unintentional. Dahmer said that he had no memory of how Tuomi died, but when he woke up after a night of heavy drinking, he found Tuomi dead beside him. Despite his initial shock, Dahmer instinctively knew how to handle the situation. He purchased a large suitcase, transported Tuomi's body back to his grandmother's house where he was living at the time, and proceeded to dismember and dispose of the body. Tuomi's murder marked the beginning of a 4-year period in which Dahmer would kill 15 more young men. With each subsequent murder, Dahmer's methods became more refined and his urges darker. Following Tuomi's death, Dahmer began actively seeking out victims, usually targeting young men in gay bars or clubs in Milwaukee. He often lured his victims with promises of money in exchange for nude photographs, or simply invited them to his apartment to drink and hang out. Once there, he would drug their drinks, rendering them unconscious. He would then strangle them before engaging in acts of necrophilia. His preferred method of disposal was dismembering the bodies, keeping some of the remains as grisly trophies. Over time, Dahmer's desire for complete control escalated, and he began experimenting with various horrifying practices in an attempt to create what he called living zombies. In 1990, after several murders, Dahmer moved into apartment 213 at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee. This apartment became the site of some of his most gruesome crimes. The location gave him privacy, and he no longer lived under the watchful eye of his grandmother, who had previously suspected his odd behavior. In this apartment, Dahmer's killing spree intensified. He began killing more frequently and with greater brutality. One of his most disturbing practices was his attempt to turn some of his victims into docile, submissive beings who would remain with him indefinitely. To achieve this, he drilled holes into their skulls and injected hydrochloric acid or boiling water into their brains. These experiments always failed, resulting in the victims' deaths, but they revealed the depths of Dahmer's twisted desire for control over his victims. Among the many victims during this period were Raymond Smith, a 33-year-old whom Dahmer lured with an offer of money for photographs in May 1990, and 14-year-old Konorak Synthasamphone, whom Dahmer killed in May 1991. Synthasamphone's death is particularly notorious because it exposed a crucial missed opportunity to stop Dahmer. Earlier, Dahmer had successfully lured the boy to his apartment, where he drugged and attempted to perform one of his zombie experiments. Synthasamphone briefly escaped the apartment, wandering the streets while disoriented and naked. 2 women found him and called the police, but when officers arrived, Dahmer convinced them that the boy was his adult lover, claiming they had simply had a lover's quarrel. Despite Synthasamphone's obvious distress, the police returned him to Dahmer's custody, dismissing the concerns of the witnesses. Once the officers left, Dahmer killed the boy, dismembered his body, and kept his skull. As his crimes escalated, so did Dahmer's fascination with preserving parts of his victims. He began collecting skulls and bones, keeping them as macabre souvenirs. He also experimented with cannibalism, admitting later that he consumed portions of the flesh of several victims. Dahmer's desire to retain a permanent part of his victims extended beyond bones. He stored various body parts, including hearts, livers, and hands, in his apartment. These grotesque collections fueled Dahmer's fantasies of possession and control, as he felt that by consuming parts of his victims or keeping their remains, they became a part of him. Between 1987 and 1991, Dahmer's murders followed a chillingly consistent pattern. He would often choose victims based on their vulnerability, preying on those who were isolated, homeless, or young gay men of color. In some cases, he would meet his victims at bars or nightclubs, while in other instances, he targeted them on the streets. Once back at his apartment, Dahmer would offer them drinks that were laced with sedatives, rendering them unconscious and helpless. He would then strangle them, have sex with their lifeless bodies, and proceed to dismember and dispose of them. In some instances, Dahmer took photographs of his victims at different stages of the process, allowing him to relive the murders long after they had occurred. These photos were later found by the police and served as crucial evidence against him. One of the final victims in Dahmer's killing spree was 20-year-old Matt Turner, who was murdered in July 1991. Turner had been lured to Dahmer's apartment under the pretext of a modeling job. Dahmer strangled him, dismembered his body, and kept some of his remains. In the same month, Dahmer also killed 25-year-old Jeremiah Weinberger, whom he met at a Chicago bar. Weinberger was lured to Dahmer's apartment, where he was drugged and subjected to one of Dahmer's experiments involving boiling water injected into his skull. This would ultimately lead to Weinberger's death, making him one of the final victims before Dahmer was caught. Dahmer's final victim was Joseph Breithoft, a 25-year-old father of 3, whom he killed in July 1991. As with his other victims, Breithoft was drugged and strangled, and Dahmer kept parts of his remains in his apartment. However, Dahmer's reign of terror would soon come to an end. On July 22, 1991, Dahmer met 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, who would eventually lead to his capture. Dahmer lured Edwards to his apartment, but Edwards managed to escape after being threatened by Dahmer. He fled the apartment and flagged down 2 police officers, leading them back to Dahmer's apartment. What they found inside shocked the world. Polaroid photos of dismembered bodies, skulls, and other human remains stored in various containers, including a human head in the refrigerator. This discovery led to Dahmer's immediate arrest and the subsequent investigation that uncovered the full extent of his horrifying crimes. In total, Jeffrey Dahmer killed 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. His gruesome methods of murder, dismemberment, necrophilia, and cannibalism shocked the world and left an indelible mark on American crime history. The fact that Dahmer was able to evade capture for so long, despite several close calls, raised serious questions about law enforcement's handling of his case, especially regarding missed opportunities to stop him earlier. Dahmer's killing spree came to an end on July 22, 1991, when one of his would-be victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape from Dahmer's apartment and flagged down 2 police officers. Edwards led the officers back to Dahmer's apartment, where they discovered photographs of dismembered bodies, a severed human head in the refrigerator, and various other body parts. Dahmer was immediately arrested and later confessed in detail to all 17 murders. His trial began in January 1992, and despite his defense team's efforts to argue that he was insane, Dahmer was found legally sane and guilty of his crimes. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Dahmer was sent to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, where he reportedly became a born-again Christian and expressed remorse for his actions. However, his time in prison was short-lived. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, while performing prison work. Scarver claimed that Dahmer had been taunting other inmates and that he felt compelled to kill him. Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes shocked the world due to their sheer brutality and bizarre nature. His story has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and films. The nature of his killings, particularly the necrophilia and cannibalism, made him one of the most infamous serial killers in history. Dahmer's case also raised important questions about law enforcement, mental health, and the justice system, particularly after it was revealed that police had missed several opportunities to apprehend him earlier. For example, in 1991, police officers returned a 14-year-old victim, Konarak Synthasmphone, to Dahmer's custody after Dahmer convinced them the boy was his adult lover, despite the boy being visibly injured and incoherent. Synthasmphone was later murdered by Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of the most chilling figures in criminal history. His gruesome acts, combined with his calm and seemingly normal demeanor, left an indelible mark on popular culture and criminology, symbolizing the darkest extremes of human behavior.